In medieval Wallachia, a land squeezed between empires, death was never far away. But for thousands who crossed one particular ruler, death arrived in a form so agonizing that it would sear itself into the memory of an entire continent. A sharpened wooden stake, thick as a man's arm. The victim hoisted up, the point finding its entry, gravity doing its patient work over hours or even days. The stake rounded at the tip to push aside organs rather than rupture them, prolonging consciousness, stretching out the dying. And when it was done at scale, the results were forests of the dead. Thousands of bodies suspended on wooden poles, left to rot as warnings to all who passed. The man who perfected this method was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia. To Romanians, he was Vlad III, Vlad the Impaler. To the wider world, he became Dracula. Not the vampire. The real Dracula never drank blood. What he did was far worse. He spent his childhood as a hostage of the Ottoman Empire and watched his father and brother murdered by noblemen they had trusted. By the time he seized power, Vlad had learned that mercy was weakness and that the most effective terror was terror that could be seen for miles. Contemporary accounts suggest he killed between 40 and 100,000 people, in a principality with a total population of perhaps 500,000. He impaled Ottoman soldiers and Wallachian peasants, German merchants and petty thieves. He reportedly dined among the dying, dipping his bread in their blood. And yet today, in Romania, Vlad is celebrated as a national hero. How does a man responsible for forests of impaled corpses become a patriotic symbol? How did a medieval warlord transform into a fictional vampire? And what does it tell us about the stories we choose to remember, and the uncomfortable truths we choose to forget? So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us travel back to the 15th century, when a boy named Dracula learned that the only way to survive was to become the thing that everyone feared. Welcome to Horrible Fishtories, where we dive into the murkiest waters of the past. If you're enjoying this journey into the darker depths of history, please consider liking and subscribing for more tales of history's most reviled figures. Where are you watching from tonight? Whether you're settling in for sleep in the shadow of the Carpathians or somewhere the Impaler never could have imagined, leave a comment below and join our school. They sent his head to Constantinople to prove he was finally dead, but 5 centuries later, the real Dracula refuses to stay buried. Even our guppies are keeping one eye open for this one. To understand the man who would become Dracula, we must first understand the land that made him. Wallachia in the 15th century was not a country in any modern sense. It was a borderland, a buffer zone, a prize fought over by powers far greater than itself, and it was a death trap for anyone foolish enough to rule it. Picture the map of southeastern Europe in the 1400s. To the south and east, the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful military force on earth, still expanding, still hungry, its armies having already swallowed Bulgaria and Serbia, and now pressing against the gates of Christian Europe. To the north and west, the Kingdom of Hungary, wealthy, ambitious, desperate to hold back the Ottoman tide, and willing to use any tool at its disposal, including the small principalities that lay between itself and the Turks. And caught in the middle, Wallachia, a strip of land running from the Carpathian Mountains down to the Danube River, perhaps 300 miles long and 100 miles wide, home to maybe 500,000 souls who had the misfortune of living on the most contested ground in Europe. To the northeast lay Moldavia, a sister principality facing similar pressures. Together, these Romanian-speaking lands form the front line of a civilizational conflict between Christian Europe and the Islamic Ottoman Empire. It was not a good place to be. Wallachia's political system made matters worse. Unlike the hereditary monarchies of Western Europe, where the eldest son of a king automatically inherited the throne, Wallachia operated as an elective principality. The ruling prince, called the voivode, was chosen from among the eligible members of the royal Basarab dynasty, but the actual selection was made by the boyars, the landed nobility who controlled most of the country's wealth and military power. In theory, this allowed for the most capable candidate to be chosen. In practice, it meant constant civil war. The Basarab dynasty had ruled Wallachia since its founding in the early 1300s, but over generations the family had split into rival branches, each with its own claim to legitimacy. The two main factions were the Danesht and the Draculesht, names that would echo through decades of murder and counter-murder. When one branch held power, the other plotted in exile. When an opportunity arose, a military defeat, a moment of weakness, a bribe to the right boyars, the exiled branch would invade, kill the reigning prince, and take the throne for themselves. Then the cycle would repeat. Between 1300 and 1500, Wallachia had over 20 different rulers. Some reigned for years, others for months. Many died violently. The boyars who controlled access to the throne grew accustomed to playing kingmaker, switching allegiances whenever the political wind shifted, always backing whoever seemed most likely to win and most likely to reward their support. Loyalty in Wallachia was a transaction, not a principle. This internal chaos might have been manageable if Wallachia had been left alone, but Wallachia was never left alone. The Ottoman Empire had been extracting tribute from Wallachia since 1417, when the great voivode Mircea the Elder, Vlad's grandfather, had been forced to acknowledge Ottoman suzerainty after years of resistance. The terms were humiliating but survivable. Wallachia would pay an annual tribute in gold, provide military support when called upon, and refrain from making foreign alliances without Ottoman permission. In exchange, the Ottomans would not annex Wallachia outright and would allow it to govern its own internal affairs. It was the kind of deal a small country makes with a neighbouring superpower. Independence in name, subordination in fact. But Wallachia also had another option, and this is what made its position so dangerous. The Kingdom of Hungary wanted Wallachia too, not to annex it, but to use it as a buffer state, a first line of defence against Ottoman expansion, a source of soldiers and resources for the endless wars along the Danube. Hungarian kings were willing to support Wallachian princes who aligned with them, providing money, troops, and refuge when things went wrong. The price was similar to what the Ottomans demanded: loyalty, military cooperation, and a willingness to fight. A clever Wallachian prince could play these two powers against each other, extracting benefits from both while committing fully to neither. But the margin for error was razor thin. Lean too far toward Hungary, and the Ottomans would invade. Lean too far toward the Ottomans, and Hungary would back a rival claimant. Try to stay neutral, and both sides would view you as unreliable. The game required perfect timing, perfect information, and perfect luck. Most princes had none of these. It was into this world that Vlad's father entered, a man who would try to play both sides and ultimately be destroyed by both. Vlad II, the man history calls Vlad Dracula, was a younger son of Mircea the Elder, raised in the Hungarian court and groomed as a potential claimant to the Wallachian throne. His opportunity for advancement came in 1431, when he was inducted into the Order of the Dragon. The Order of the Dragon, Societas Draconistarum in Latin, had been founded in 1408 by Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary and later Holy Roman Emperor. It was a chivalric order, modelled on the crusading orders of earlier centuries, and its stated purpose was the defence of Christianity against its enemies, primarily the Ottoman Turks, but also heretics and pagans wherever they might be found. Membership was a mark of prestige and an indication of political alignment with Hungary and the broader Catholic world. When Vlad II received the Order of the Dragon, he adopted its symbol as his own. Dragon imagery appeared on his coins, his seals, his banners. In Romanian, the dragon is called Dracul, and Vlad II became known as Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Dragon. It was a statement of intent, a declaration that he stood with Christian Europe against the Ottoman threat. But Dracul had another meaning in Romanian. It also meant devil. And when Vlad II had sons, they inherited the name in a modified form. The suffix "a" indicated son of Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the devil. It was a name that could be read two ways, and history would ensure that both readings came true. Vlad Dracula was born in the winter of 1431, most likely in the Transylvanian citadel town of Sighișoara. His father was in exile at the time, waiting for his chance at the Wallachian throne, living under Hungarian protection while rivals controlled the principality he believed was rightfully his. It was not an auspicious beginning. The future Impaler entered the world as the son of a landless pretender, a prince without a country, dependent on the goodwill of foreign powers for his very survival. Sighișoara was a Saxon merchant town, one of several German-speaking settlements that dotted Transylvania. It sat on a hill overlooking the Târnava Mare River, surrounded by walls and watchtowers, its cobblestone streets lined with the houses of craftsmen and traders. The building where Vlad is believed to have been born still stands today. A yellow three-storey house in the old town centre, now a restaurant trading on its macabre connection. Whether this specific building is truly his birthplace is uncertain. The documentation is thin, but the town itself is well attested. Vlad Dracula maintained a residence there during his years of waiting, and it was there that his second son came into the world. The boy was named Vlad after his father, as was customary. He was the second of at least 4 sons. His elder brother Mircea had been born a few years earlier, and would eventually rule Wallachia briefly before meeting a terrible end. His younger brother Radu, born around 1435, would become his bitter rival. A fourth brother, Vlad Călugărul, Vlad the Monk, was born to a different mother, and would outlive them all, eventually taking the throne himself decades later. For the first 5 years of his life, young Vlad knew only exile. His father schemed and negotiated, building alliances, accumulating debts, waiting for the moment when he could strike. That moment came in 1436, when Vlad Dracul finally gathered enough Hungarian support to invade Wallachia and seized the throne from Alexandru I Aldea, a member of the rival Danesti branch. The invasion succeeded. Alexandru fled, then died shortly afterward, possibly from natural causes, possibly not. Vlad Dracul was now voivode of Wallachia, and his young family moved south from Transylvania to take up residence in the princely capital of Târgoviște. Vlad Dracula was perhaps 5 years old when he first saw the court. He would one day rule through terror. Târgoviște was no great city by European standards. Perhaps 10,000 inhabitants, a modest princely palace, a handful of churches and monasteries, surrounded by wooden houses and unpaved streets that turned to mud in the rain. But it was the centre of Wallachian power, the place where boyars gathered to pledge allegiance and plot betrayal, where foreign ambassadors delivered ultimatums, where the fate of the principality was decided. For a child, it must have seemed grand enough. The next 6 years were a masterclass in political survival, though young Vlad may not have understood the lessons at the time. His father faced an impossible situation. He had taken the throne with Hungarian backing and wore the Order of the Dragon as proof of his Christian allegiance. But Hungary was far away, and the Ottoman Empire was very close. Sultan Murad II commanded armies that could crush Wallachia in a matter of weeks. Defiance meant destruction. So Vlad Dracula did what Wallachian princes had to do. He bent. In 1437, just a year after seizing power, Vlad Dracula travelled to the Ottoman court and acknowledged Sultan Murad as his overlord. He agreed to pay tribute, to provide military assistance when demanded, and to refrain from acting against Ottoman interests. It was a betrayal of everything the Order of the Dragon represented, but it was also the price of keeping his throne and his head. The Hungarians were furious. The Ottomans were satisfied, at least temporarily, and Vlad Dracula had bought himself time. But time in Wallachia always ran out. By 1442, the pressure had become unbearable. Hungary, now led by the formidable military commander János Hunyadi, was preparing a major campaign against the Ottomans and expected Wallachian support. The Ottomans, aware of Hungarian plans, demanded that Vlad Dracula prove his loyalty by appearing in person at the Sultan's court. It was a trap, and Vlad Dracula knew it. But refusing the summons meant war with an enemy he could not defeat. He had no good options, only bad ones and worse ones. In the summer of 1442, Vlad Dracula made his choice. He travelled to Adrianople, the city the Turks called Edirne, to meet with Sultan Murad. He brought gifts and assurances of loyalty. He also brought his two younger sons, Vlad and Radu, aged 11 and 7. What happened next would shape the rest of Vlad Dracula's life. The meeting with the Sultan did not go as planned. Murad was not interested in assurances. He wanted guarantees. Vlad Dracula was accused of secretly supporting Hungarian military efforts, of playing both sides, of being an unreliable vassal. The accusations were largely true, which made them difficult to refute. The Sultan's solution was elegant in its cruelty. Vlad Dracula would be allowed to return to Wallachia and continue ruling as an Ottoman vassal, but his sons would remain behind as hostages. The logic was simple. If Vlad Dracula remained loyal, his sons would be treated well, educated, housed comfortably, perhaps even given positions of honour in the Ottoman court. If he betrayed the Sultan, his sons would die. It was the same arrangement the Ottomans had used with dozens of vassal rulers, a system of human collateral that had proved remarkably effective at ensuring compliance. Vlad Dracula had no choice but to accept, and so, in 1442, 11-year-old Vlad Dracula and his younger brother Radu were handed over to the Ottomans and taken deep into the empire. Their father rode back to Wallachia, his throne secured but his sons forfeit. He would not see them again for years. For Vlad, it was the end of childhood. Everything that came after, the paranoia, the cruelty, the obsessive need for control, the hatred of both the Ottomans, who held him captive, and the father who traded him away, can be traced to this moment. An 11-year-old boy, torn from his family, delivered into the hands of his nation's enemies, knowing that his life depended on the good behaviour of a father he could no longer trust. The lessons of the Ottoman court would take years to unfold, but they would be learned thoroughly, and Wallachia would eventually pay the price for every one of them. The Ottoman system of holding noble hostages was not designed to be cruel. It was designed to be effective. Sons of vassal rulers were brought to the imperial court, housed in reasonable comfort, educated alongside Ottoman elites, and trained in the skills expected of future leaders. The implicit bargain was straightforward: behave, learn, wait, and one day you might be sent home to rule your father's lands as a loyal friend of the Sultan. Resist, cause trouble, or give the Ottomans reason to doubt your family's loyalty, and you would simply disappear. Vlad and Radu were taken to Edirne, the Ottoman capital before Constantinople fell, and later moved to the fortress of Erigos in Anatolia, where high-value hostages were kept under closer watch. The accommodations were not dungeons. The boys had servants, received regular meals, and were given access to tutors. But they were prisoners nonetheless, surrounded by guards, watched constantly, their movements restricted, their futures entirely dependent on decisions made hundreds of miles away by a father they could no longer see. The education provided to hostages like Vlad was comprehensive and deliberately designed to create future allies. Both boys learned Turkish, the language of the empire that controlled their fate. They studied Ottoman court protocol, the elaborate rituals of greeting, the hierarchies of rank, the careful etiquette that governed interactions with the Sultan and his officials. They received instruction in military tactics, horsemanship, and the arts of war as practiced by the most successful fighting force in the Mediterranean world. They were also exposed to Islamic culture, philosophy, and literature, though conversion was not required. It was, in many ways, an excellent education. Several hostages who passed through the Ottoman system emerged as sophisticated, capable rulers who maintained productive relationships with the empire for decades. The system worked precisely because it created genuine bonds. Boys raised together, trained together, sometimes forming friendships that lasted into adulthood. But Vlad didn't form friendships. By all accounts, he formed hatreds. The sources that describe Vlad's time as a hostage paint a picture of stubborn defiance. Where other hostages adapted and ingratiated themselves, Vlad resisted. He was described as cunning and difficult, prone to outbursts, unwilling to show the deference that his situation demanded. He was punished. The sources do not specify how, but the punishments did not break him. They hardened him. His younger brother Radu took the opposite path. Radu was charming, adaptable, and beautiful. Sources consistently note his physical attractiveness. He learned Turkish fluently, embraced Ottoman culture, and won favour with the court. Later accounts, written after both brothers were dead, suggest that Radu became a personal favourite of the young prince, who would later rule as Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The nature of their relationship has been debated by historians, with some sources implying a romantic or sexual dimension. What is certain is that Radu emerged from captivity as a committed Ottoman ally, while Vlad emerged as something else entirely. During these years, Vlad would have witnessed Ottoman justice firsthand. The empire maintained order through a legal system that was, by the standards of the age, relatively consistent and codified. But the punishments for serious crimes were severe, and the Ottomans employed impalement as a method of execution for traitors, rebels, and certain categories of criminals. Vlad would have seen impaled bodies displayed as warnings. He would have understood the message such displays were meant to send. Whether he was horrified or fascinated or simply taking notes, we cannot know, but the method lodged itself in his mind. Then in 1447, news arrived that shattered whatever remained of Vlad's childhood. His father was dead. So was his elder brother Mircea. The details were brutal even by Wallachian standards. Vlad Dracula had continued his dangerous game of playing Hungary against the Ottomans, and in 1447 the game caught up with him. János Hunyadi, the Hungarian military commander who had been fighting the Ottomans for years, concluded that Vlad Dracula could no longer be trusted. Hunyadi backed a rival claimant, Vladislav II of the Danish branch, and invaded Wallachia. Vlad Dracula was caught and killed, probably in December of 1447, near the town of Bolteni. The murder of his brother Mircea was worse. Mircea had been left in Wallachia while his father was away, attempting to hold on to power. When the coup came, he was captured by the boyars of Târgoviște, the same nobles who had once pledged loyalty to his father. According to chronicles written in the following decades, Mircea was tortured before being killed. His eyes were burned out with hot iron stakes. Then, possibly still alive, he was buried in the ground outside the city. The boyars who did this were settling scores and securing their positions with the new regime. They had betrayed Vlad Dracula, and they needed his heir dead to prevent future revenge. Their methods sent a message about what happened to princes who lost power in Wallachia. Vlad, still a hostage in Ottoman territory, learned of these events second-hand. His father, who had traded him to the Ottomans as a bargaining chip, was gone. His elder brother, who should have inherited the throne, had been mutilated and buried by men who had eaten at his family's table. The Danish now ruled Wallachia with Hungarian support, and Vlad himself was 16 years old, alone, surrounded by the enemies of his faith, with no throne, no army, no family, and no future that he could see. Historians have long debated how much of Vlad's later cruelty can be traced to these formative traumas. The question may be unanswerable, but it does not seem coincidental that a boy who was abandoned by his father, held hostage by one empire, and informed that his brother had been blinded and buried alive by treacherous nobles, would grow into a man who trusted no one and punished betrayal with spectacular violence. The lessons of Vlad's youth were simple and harsh. Power was survival. Mercy was weakness. And anyone who showed vulnerability would eventually find themselves at the mercy of men who had none. The Ottomans had invested 6 years in Vlad Dracula. They had fed him, educated him, and kept him alive while his father played his doomed double game. Now, with Vlad Dracula dead and the Danish branch installed in Wallachia with Hungarian backing, the Ottomans saw an opportunity. A grateful Draculesque prince on the Wallachian throne would be far more useful than a hostile Danish one. In 1448, they decided to cash in their investment. Vlad was 17 years old when the Ottomans released him and provided military support for an invasion of Wallachia. The details of this first campaign are sparse in the historical record, but the outline is clear. Ottoman cavalry accompanied Vlad across the Danube and into Wallachian territory. The reigning prince, Vladislav II, the same man whose faction had murdered Vlad's father and brother, was away from the capital, distracted by other matters. Vlad seized Târgoviște and declared himself voivode. His first reign lasted approximately 2 months, perhaps less. The problem was timing. Vladislav II had been absent because he was participating in a major military campaign alongside János Hunyadi, the very man who had orchestrated the coup against Vlad's father. In October of 1448, Hunyadi led a massive Hungarian and Wallachian army against the Ottomans at the Second Battle of Kosovo. The battle was a disaster for the Christian forces. Hunyadi's army was crushed, and he barely escaped with his life. But defeat did not mean destruction. Hunyadi still commanded significant forces, and Vladislav II still had Hungarian backing. When word reached them that an Ottoman-supported pretender had seized Târgoviște, they moved quickly. By late 1448, Vladislav had returned with enough troops to drive Vlad out. The young prince who had briefly tasted power found himself fleeing north, a refugee once again. What followed were 8 years of wandering, scheming, and survival. Vlad's movements during this period are difficult to track with precision, but the general pattern is clear. He went first to Moldavia, the principality northeast of Wallachia, where his uncle Bogdan II ruled. Bogdan was his mother's brother, or possibly his father's ally through marriage. The exact family connection is debated, and Moldavia offered temporary refuge from both the Ottomans and the Hungarians. Vlad spent roughly 3 years in Moldavia from 1448 to 1451. It was not a peaceful time. Moldavia faced its own pressures, its own rival claimants, its own dance between great powers. But for Vlad, it was a chance to regroup, to grow from an inexperienced teenager into a young man capable of playing the political game that had killed his father. Then, in 1451, Bogdan II was assassinated. The killer was a rival named Petru Aron, who seized the Moldavian throne with the support of disaffected boyars. Vlad had to flee again. His uncle's murder was another lesson in the fragility of power, another reminder that loyalty among the nobility was a commodity to be bought and sold. Petru Aron would eventually face his own reckoning. Years later, Vlad would hunt him across borders and demand his extradition, but in 1451, Vlad was in no position to seek revenge for anything. With Moldavia closed to him, Vlad made a decision that must have been extraordinarily difficult. He went to Hungary and sought the protection of János Hunyadi. This requires emphasis. János Hunyadi had backed the faction that killed Vlad's father. Hunyadi had supported Vladislav II, the man who now sat on the Wallachian throne. Hunyadi was, in a very direct sense, responsible for the destruction of Vlad's family. And yet, Vlad went to him, bent the knee, and offered his services. The alliance made a certain brutal sense. Hunyadi was the most powerful military figure in Hungary, the man who had spent decades fighting the Ottomans, and who would continue fighting them until his death. He needed allies, agents, and potential claimants who could be installed in neighbouring principalities when the political situation allowed. Vlad was a Draculesque prince with a legitimate claim to the Wallachian throne, military training courtesy of the Ottomans, and a burning desire to reclaim what he had lost. He was useful. For Vlad, the calculation was simpler. He had no army, no money, no territory, and no other options. The Ottomans had already used him once, and might not be inclined to invest in him again, especially after his first reign had collapsed so quickly. Moldavia was now hostile. The Donetsk controlled Wallachia. Hungary was the only remaining power that might support a second attempt, and Hunyadi was Hungary's real decision-maker. Pride was a luxury Vlad could not afford. So began an unlikely partnership. From 1451 to 1456, Vlad lived in Transylvania under Hungarian protection, probably in the towns of Sibiu and later Brasov. He participated in border defence operations against Ottoman raids. He learned Hungarian methods of warfare and administration. He waited, watched, and planned. During these years, Vladislav II remained on the Wallachian throne, but his position was deteriorating. He had begun to tilt toward the Ottomans, paying tribute and distancing himself from Hungarian influence. This made him increasingly unreliable in Hunyadi's eyes. A prince who switched sides once could switch sides again. Perhaps it was time to consider alternatives. The decisive moment came in the summer of 1456. In July, Hunyadi achieved his greatest military victory at the Siege of Belgrade, breaking an Ottoman attempt to capture that crucial fortress city. It was a triumph that would echo through European history, celebrated with church bells that still ring at noon in Catholic countries today. But the victory came at a cost. weeks after the battle, Janos Hunyadi died of plague in his camp, probably contracted from the corpses that littered the battlefield. Hunyadi's death threw Hungarian politics into chaos. His sons scrambled to secure their inheritance. Rivals circled, and in the confusion, Vlad saw his chance. In August of 1456, Vlad invaded Wallachia with a small force of Hungarian-supported troops. The campaign was swift and decisive. Vladislav II, caught off guard by the timing, was unable to mount an effective defence. The two claimants met in battle near the town of Targshaw, and in the fighting, Vlad personally killed Vladislav. Some accounts suggest it was single combat, a duel between rival princes that ended with Vlad's sword finding its mark. Whether or not the details are romanticised, the outcome is certain. Vladislav II died on the battlefield. Vlad Dracula, at 25 years old, was finally voivode of Wallachia. He had spent 8 years in exile. He had been betrayed, abandoned, hunted, and forced to ally with the man who destroyed his family. He had learned that survival required ruthlessness, that loyalty was an illusion, and that the only reliable tool of power was fear. Now he had a throne, and he intended to keep it. Vlad had seen what the boyars did to princes who showed weakness. His father had trusted them and been betrayed. His brother Mircea had been blinded, tortured, and buried alive by nobles who had sworn oaths of loyalty. Vladislav II, despite years on the throne, had been unable to prevent his own overthrow once Hungarian support arrived. The lesson was unmistakable. In Wallachia, the boyars made and unmade rulers at will. Any prince who wished to survive had to break their power before they broke him. Vlad began immediately. Within months of taking the throne in August of 1456, he launched a systematic campaign against the Wallachian nobility. This was not random violence. It was targeted destruction, aimed first at the families most directly implicated in his father's murder and his brother's torture, then expanded to encompass any boyar whose loyalty seemed questionable, which, given recent history, meant nearly all of them. The most dramatic episode came at Easter, probably in 1459, though some scholars place it earlier. The exact date has been debated, but the event itself is attested in multiple sources, including the German pamphlets that would later spread Vlad's infamy across Europe. Vlad invited the boyar families of Târgoviște to an Easter feast at the princely court. It was a traditional occasion, a time when nobles gathered to celebrate the holy day and reaffirm their relationship with the ruling prince. The boyars came dressed in their finest clothes, accompanied by their wives, children and retainers. They ate, drank, and perhaps congratulated themselves on having survived yet another transition of power. Then Vlad asked a question. According to the accounts, he inquired how many princes each boyar had seen come and go during their lifetimes. The older nobles, proud of their longevity and political experience, gave their answers freely. Some had served 5 princes. Some had served 7. A few could remember even more. This was precisely the information Vlad wanted. The men who had survived multiple changes of ruler were, by definition, the men who had facilitated those changes. They were the kingmakers, the power brokers, the nobles who had learned to switch allegiances at the opportune moment. They had survived because they were dangerous. Vlad had them arrested on the spot. The older boyars, those who had lived through too many reigns, were impaled outside the city walls. Their deaths were not quick. Impalement, as practiced by Vlad, was designed to prolong suffering, and the screams of the dying nobles would have been audible throughout Târgoviște. But Vlad was not finished with the survivors. The younger and healthier boyars, along with their families, were not killed immediately. Instead, they were stripped of their fine Easter clothes and marched north under armed guard. Their destination was a ruined fortress high in the Carpathian Mountains, a place called Ponari. The march was brutal. Sources describe the boyars walking until their clothes fell apart, until their shoes disintegrated, until they were barefoot and bleeding on the mountain roads. When they arrived at Ponari, they were put to work. Their task was to rebuild the fortress from its crumbling foundations, carrying bricks up the mountainside, mixing mortar, constructing walls. They laboured as slaves, and many died from exhaustion, exposure, or mistreatment. The reconstruction of Ponari Castle took months, possibly years. When it was complete, Vlad had a stronghold perched on a cliff, overlooking the Argesh River, accessible only by a narrow staircase carved into the rock. It was virtually impregnable, positioned far from the traditional centres of boyar power, and staffed entirely by men who owed their positions to Vlad, rather than to hereditary privilege. The fortress was a statement made in stone. The old order was finished. The destruction of the boyars at Easter was the most theatrical of Vlad's actions against the nobility, but it was not an isolated event. Throughout his reign, he continued to eliminate nobles who posed potential threats, confiscating their lands and redistributing them to loyal followers. He created a new class of military and administrative servants called slugitori, drawn primarily from free peasants, foreign mercenaries, and men of low birth who had no connection to the traditional aristocracy. These men owed everything to Vlad personally. Their status, their lands, their very survival depended on his continued rule. They had no incentive to conspire with rival claimants or foreign powers, because they had nothing to gain from a change of regime. Vlad also centralised judicial authority in his own hands, stripping away the legal privileges that boyars had traditionally exercised over the peasants who worked their lands. Justice in Wallachia became the prince's justice, administered directly or through appointed officials, rather than through hereditary noble courts. The punishments were harsh: impalement for serious crimes, mutilation for lesser ones. But they were also consistent. A thief would be impaled whether he stole from a boyar or a peasant. The law, such as it was, applied to everyone. The cumulative effect of these policies was the transformation of Wallachia from an aristocratic elective principality into something approaching an autocratic state. The boyars who had once controlled access to the throne were dead, exiled, or cowed into submission. The new men who served Vlad had no institutional power base independent of the prince. The elaborate system of checks and balances that had allowed nobles to constrain and remove rulers had been dismantled. This was Vlad's solution to the problem that had plagued Wallachia for generations. If the boyars could not be trusted, they would be destroyed. If no existing institution could guarantee his security, he would create new institutions loyal only to himself. If the traditional political system made princes vulnerable, he would replace that system with naked autocracy backed by terror. It worked for a time. Vlad faced no serious internal challenges during the 6 years of his second reign. No boyar conspiracy succeeded in overthrowing him. No rival claimant found domestic support for an uprising. The men who might have plotted against him were dead, enslaved, or too frightened to act. But Vlad had solved one problem only to create others. A prince who ruled through terror could not afford to show weakness. And weakness, in 15th century Wallachia, was always one military defeat away. Vlad did not invent impalement. The method had been used for centuries across the ancient and medieval world, from the Assyrians to the Persians to the Ottomans themselves. What Vlad did was perfect it, systematise it, and employ it on a scale that shocked even his contemporaries. By the time his reign ended, the practice had become so associated with him that history would remember him not by his family name, not by his title, but simply as the Impaler. The technical process was designed to maximise suffering while prolonging death. A wooden stake, typically the thickness of a man's arm, was carefully prepared with a rounded, oiled tip, rather than a sharp point. The victim was positioned over the stake, which was then inserted through the body, usually entering through the lower regions. The rounded tip was essential. A sharp stake would pierce vital organs quickly, causing rapid death. The rounded version pushed organs aside rather than rupturing them, allowing the victim to remain conscious as the stake worked its way slowly through the body cavity, eventually emerging near the shoulder or neck. The process could take hours. Some victims survived for days, suspended on their stakes in full view of the public, their agony serving as a warning to anyone who might consider defying Vlad's authority. The stakes were often arranged in geometric patterns outside city walls, along roadsides, or at the borders of Vlad's territory. Forests of the impaled became a signature of his rule, visible from miles away, impossible to ignore or forget. Vlad applied this punishment with remarkable consistency. Criminals faced impalement for theft, regardless of the value stolen. Merchants who cheated their customers could find themselves on stakes. Liars, adulterers, and women accused of sexual impropriety were impaled. The laws were harsh, but they were also predictable. Everyone knew the rules, and everyone knew the consequences. The most famous illustration of Vlad's justice is the story of the Golden Cup. According to accounts preserved in both German pamphlets and Russian chronicles, Vlad placed a golden cup at a public fountain in the central square of Târgoviște. The cup was left there permanently, available for anyone who wished to drink. It was never stolen. Throughout Vlad's reign, the cup remained untouched, not because guards protected it, but because everyone understood what would happen to a thief. The story may be apocryphal, but its persistence across multiple independent sources suggests it captured something true about the climate of fear that Vlad cultivated. The victims of impalement were not limited to common criminals. Political enemies died on stakes in large numbers. Ottoman soldiers captured in battle were impaled as a matter of course, their bodies displayed along the Danube frontier as warnings to future invaders. Disloyal boyars and their families, as we have seen, were subjected to mass impalement following the Easter feast. Transylvanian Saxon merchants who had supported rival claimants or violated Vlad's commercial regulations were impaled during raids on their towns. Roma communities, already marginalised and vulnerable, were targeted for impalement in documented incidents, though the full scale of violence against them is difficult to determine from surviving sources. The geographic spread of these executions covered the entirety of Vlad's domain and beyond. Mass impalement sites are documented at Târgoviște, the princely capital. The suburbs of Brașov, a major Saxon trading city in Transylvania, were attacked in 1459, with merchants and villagers impaled in large numbers. Similar raids struck the area around Sibiu. Along the Danube, where Wallachia bordered Ottoman territory, impaled bodies became a regular feature of the landscape during Vlad's military campaigns. How many people died? The numbers cited in contemporary sources vary wildly and must be treated with caution. German pamphlets, written by Vlad's enemies and designed to horrify readers, claim totals as high as 100,000. Ottoman chroniclers, also hostile, provided similarly inflated figures. Modern historians generally consider these numbers exaggerated, though establishing accurate counts is impossible given the fragmentary nature of the evidence. The scholarly consensus, such as it exists, suggests that the lower estimates, somewhere in the range of 40,000 to 60,000 victims, are more plausible, though still uncertain. Even at the lower end, these numbers would make Vlad one of the most prolific killers of the medieval period, particularly given the small population of Wallachia. A principality of perhaps 500,000 people, losing 40,000 to execution over 6 years, represents a staggering rate of state-sponsored killing. It is worth distinguishing between different categories of violence. Some killings were directly ordered by Vlad for specific individuals or groups. The boyars at Easter, particular merchants who had offended him, Ottoman envoys who delivered unwelcome messages. Others were carried out by subordinates operating under general instructions, such as soldiers executing prisoners after battles, or local officials enforcing Vlad's harsh legal code. Still others occurred during military campaigns, where the line between combat deaths and executions blurred. The historical sources do not always make these distinctions clear, and Vlad himself would likely not have drawn sharp lines between them. What is certain is that Vlad created and maintained a system in which mass killing was routine, expected, and publicly visible. The impaled bodies were not hidden, they were displayed. They were meant to be seen by as many people as possible, by potential criminals who might reconsider their plans, by boyars who might contemplate disloyalty, by foreign enemies who might think twice before invading. Terror was not a byproduct of Vlad's rule, it was the point. The effectiveness of this approach, measured purely in terms of maintaining order, appears to have been real. Sources from the period describe Wallachia under Vlad as remarkably free of common crime. Theft virtually disappeared. Merchants could travel roads that had previously been plagued by bandits. The brutal consistency of punishment created a kind of peace, the peace of absolute fear. Whether this peace justified the methods used to achieve it was a question that contemporaries answered differently depending on their perspective. For Wallachian peasants who had previously suffered from boyar exploitation and criminal predation, Vlad's reign may have represented genuine improvement in daily security. For the tens of thousands who died on stakes, no such calculation was possible. They were simply victims of a system that valued order above all else, including human life. The Transylvanian Saxons had been a thorn in Vlad's side long before he took the throne. These German-speaking merchants controlled the major trading cities of Brasov and Sibiu, dominating the commerce that flowed between Central Europe and the land bordering the Ottoman Empire. They were wealthy, well-organised, and politically connected. They were also, from Vlad's perspective, enemies who had supported his rivals, sheltered his foes, and systematically cheated Wallachia out of customs revenue for decades. The grievances were both political and economic. During Vlad's years in exile, the Saxon cities had provided refuge and support to Danish claimants, including a man named Dan III, who continued to assert his right to the Wallachian throne. Brasov in particular had become a haven for Vlad's enemies, a place where rival princes could raise money, recruit supporters, and plot invasions without fear of interference. The Saxons were not merely neutral parties caught between competing factions. They were active participants in Wallachian politics, backing whichever claimant seemed most likely to offer them favourable commercial terms. The economic issues ran equally deep. Transylvanian merchants had long enjoyed privileged access to Wallachian markets, buying goods cheaply and selling them at substantial markups in their own cities. They evaded Wallachian customs duties through a variety of methods, routing goods through alternative passes, bribing officials, or simply ignoring regulations they found inconvenient. Meanwhile, Wallachian merchants faced significant barriers when trying to trade in Saxon territories, subjected to discriminatory fees and restrictions that their Transylvanian counterparts did not face at home. The relationship was exploitative, and Vlad knew it. Within a year of taking the throne, Vlad began applying pressure. He demanded that the Saxon cities expel the Danish pretenders they were harbouring. He insisted on renegotiating commercial treaties to give Wallachian merchants equal access to Transylvanian markets. He threatened consequences if his demands were not met. The Saxons, accustomed to dealing with weaker Wallachian princes who needed their support more than they needed his, refused. Vlad's response was devastating. Beginning in 1457 and continuing through 1459, he launched a series of raids into Saxon territory that combined military objectives with calculated terror. His forces attacked merchant caravans travelling through mountain passes, seizing goods and killing traders. They burned villages in the rural areas surrounding Brasov and Sibiu, destroying crops and livestock. They struck at the suburbs of the cities themselves, areas outside the fortified walls where craftsmen and poorer residents lived. The violence was not random. It was designed to impose costs on the Saxon communities until they agreed to Vlad's terms, and it was accompanied by the method that had become his signature. German pamphlets produced in the following decades preserve detailed accounts of what happened during these raids, and while allowance must be made for hostile exaggeration, the core descriptions are consistent across multiple sources. Vlad impaled captured merchants and villagers in large numbers. He arranged the bodies in patterns outside the walls of Brasov, forcing the city's residents to witness the result of their leadership's defiance. According to several accounts, he dined among the impaled victims, eating meals in full view of the dying, while their screams provided background noise. One pamphlet describes Vlad having a table set up amid a forest of stakes, where he sat and ate bread while surrounded by the impaled. When one of his attendants covered his nose to block the stench of death, Vlad allegedly had the man impaled on a taller stake, so he would be above the smell. The story may be embellished, but its inclusion in multiple independent sources suggests it was widely believed, and it captures the psychological dimension of Vlad's violence. He was not merely killing his enemies. He was demonstrating that their suffering meant nothing to him, that he could feast while they died. The raids continued until Vlad had achieved his primary political objective. Dan III, the Danish claimant whom the Saxons had been sheltering, was eventually captured. The circumstances of his capture are unclear. He may have been handed over by the Saxons as a peace offering, or he may have been caught during one of Vlad's military operations. What happened next is better documented. Vlad forced Dan to dig his own grave. It was a deliberate humiliation, making the rival prince perform manual labour like a common peasant, while knowing exactly what the hole was for. When the grave was complete, Dan was made to kneel beside it. A priest read the funeral service over the living man. Then Vlad had him beheaded, and the body was placed in the grave Dan had dug himself. The execution of Dan III eliminated the most dangerous rival claimant, and sent an unmistakable message to anyone else who might consider challenging Vlad's rule. The Saxons, who had backed Dan and protected him for years, now understood that their support for pretenders carried lethal consequences. By 1460, the Saxon cities had capitulated. New commercial treaties were signed that addressed Vlad's core demands. Wallachian merchants received reciprocal trading rights in Transylvanian markets. Customs arrangements were renegotiated on terms more favourable to Wallachia. Most importantly, the Saxon cities agreed to cease harbouring Vlad's enemies. No more shelter for rival claimants, no more funding for conspiracies, no more using the threat of supporting pretenders as leverage in commercial negotiations. The Merchant War demonstrated Vlad's approach to problem solving with brutal clarity. When faced with an adversary who would not negotiate in good faith, he did not engage in extended diplomacy or seek compromise. He inflicted pain until the adversary's calculations changed. The Saxons had assumed they could continue their traditional practices because no Wallachian prince had ever made them pay a sufficient price for their behaviour. Vlad proved them wrong. The consequence of these raids, however, extended beyond the immediate political and economic gains. The Saxon merchants who survived remembered what had been done to their communities. They told their stories to printers and publishers in German-speaking cities across Europe. Within decades, pamphlets describing Vlad's atrocities were circulating widely, complete with woodcut illustrations of impalement and massacre. The Saxons could not defeat Vlad militarily, but they could destroy his reputation. In this, they succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. The image of the Wallachian prince dining among the impaled would endure for 5 centuries. For the first years of his reign, Vlad maintained the uneasy arrangement that every Wallachian prince before him had accepted. He paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire. He avoided open provocation. He played the role of a loyal vassal while quietly building his domestic power and settling scores with internal enemies. But Vlad had no intention of remaining a subordinate forever. He had spent 6 years as an Ottoman hostage. He had watched his father destroyed by the impossible game of balancing between empires. He knew that vassalage was just a slower form of subjugation, and he was not a man inclined to accept subjugation of any kind. The Sultan he faced was no ordinary adversary. Mehmed II had earned his epithet, the Conqueror, by doing what generations of Ottoman rulers had failed to accomplish. In 1453, he had captured Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire and establishing Ottoman control over the most strategically important city in the Mediterranean world. He was ambitious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He had executed his own infant brother to secure his succession, a cold calculation that eliminated a potential rival before the child could walk. Mehmed viewed the Christian principalities on his northern border as problems to be solved, and his preferred solution was absorption into the Ottoman state. Throughout the late 1450s, tensions between Vlad and the Sultan escalated steadily. Vlad delayed tribute payments, citing various excuses. He refused to appear personally at the Ottoman court to deliver the tribute himself, a traditional requirement that he knew from bitter experience could easily become a trap. His own childhood captivity had begun with just such a summons. He would not give Mehmed the same opportunity his father had given Murad. The breaking point came with a diplomatic mission dispatched by Mehmed in 1459 or 1460. The exact date is disputed in the sources. The mission was led by 2 men, a Greek official named Thomas Katavalinos and a Turkish commander called Hamza Pasha. They carried demands from the Sultan that went beyond the usual tribute arrangements. Mehmed wanted the overdue tribute paid immediately. He also wanted Vlad to surrender Wallachian boys for the devshirme, the Ottoman system of child levy that collected Christian boys from vassal territories and converted them into soldiers for the Janissary Corps. The devshirme was one of the most resented aspects of Ottoman rule, tearing children from their families and raising them as Muslim warriors loyal only to the Sultan. Vlad himself had narrowly avoided this fate during his years as a hostage. Now Mehmed was demanding that he facilitate the same process for his own subjects. The envoys may also have carried instructions to lure Vlad into a trap. Some accounts suggest they were meant to convince him to travel to the Ottoman court personally, where he could be arrested or killed. Whether this was their actual mission, or a later embellishment designed to justify what happened next, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that Vlad refused every demand, and then he went further. According to accounts preserved in multiple sources, including the German pamphlets and Ottoman chronicles, Vlad had the envoys arrested. When Katavalinos and Hamza Pasha refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming that their custom forbade them from uncovering their heads, Vlad replied that he would help them observe their custom permanently. He had their turbans nailed to their skulls with iron spikes. Then he had them impaled. The killing of diplomatic envoys was an extreme act by the standards of any era. Ambassadors were traditionally protected, their safety guaranteed even between enemies at war. By executing Mehmed's representatives in such a deliberately grotesque manner, Vlad was not merely refusing Ottoman demands. He was announcing that he considered the relationship of vassalage to be over. He was daring the most powerful ruler in the known world to do something about it. Mehmed would certainly do something about it. But Vlad did not intend to wait passively for the Ottoman response. In the winter of 1461 to 1462, he launched a preemptive offensive, crossing the Danube into Ottoman-controlled Bulgaria with a substantial Wallachian force. The campaign was devastating. Vlad's troops struck along a broad front, attacking Ottoman settlements, fortifications, and military positions throughout the region south of the Danube. They killed soldiers and civilians alike, burned villages and crops, and drove off livestock. The objective was not to hold territory. Vlad lacked the forces for permanent occupation, but to inflict maximum damage and demonstrate that the Ottoman frontier was vulnerable. We have an unusually precise account of this campaign because Vlad himself provided one. In a letter to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, dated February of 1462, Vlad reported the results of his winter offensive in remarkable detail. He claimed to have killed 23,884 people, not counting those who had been burned alive in their homes, and therefore could not be individually counted. He listed the specific towns and villages that had been destroyed. He described the campaign as a holy war against the enemies of Christendom. The letter was partly a military report, partly a diplomatic appeal. Vlad was informing Matthias of what he had accomplished and implicitly requesting support for the war that would inevitably follow. He was positioning himself as a defender of Christian Europe, a frontline warrior against Ottoman expansion, worthy of Hungarian aid in the coming struggle. Whether the specific number of 23,884 was accurate, exaggerated, or simply invented is impossible to determine. Medieval body counts were notoriously unreliable, often inflated for political purposes. But even if the true figure was substantially lower, the scale of the devastation was real. Vlad had turned the Ottoman frontier into a killing ground. Mehmed the Conqueror now had no choice but to respond. The insult to his envoys demanded vengeance. The attacks on his territory demanded punishment. A vassal prince had defied him openly, killed his representatives, and slaughtered his subjects by the thousands. Such defiance, if left unanswered, would encourage others. The Sultan began assembling the largest military force he had deployed since the conquest of Constantinople. Vlad had achieved exactly what he wanted. War was coming, and he intended to meet it on his own terms. In the spring of 1462, Mehmed the Conqueror assembled one of the largest military forces of his reign. Estimates vary among sources, but the army that crossed into Wallachia likely numbered between 60,000 and 90,000 men. It included the elite Janissary infantry, the finest soldiers in the Islamic world, professional warriors taken as children and trained for nothing but combat. It included Sipahi cavalry, heavily armoured horsemen drawn from the Ottoman feudal system. It included siege engineers, artillery crews, and vast logistical trains carrying supplies for a prolonged campaign. The Sultan himself rode at the head of this force, determined to personally oversee the destruction of the prince who had insulted him so grievously. The Ottoman army crossed the Danube in late May, probably near the fortress of Nicopolis, and began advancing north toward the Wallachian heartland. Their objective was Târgoviște, the princely capital. The plan was straightforward: march inland, crush any resistance, capture or kill Vlad, and install a more cooperative ruler. The overwhelming size of the Ottoman force suggested the campaign would be brief. Vlad understood that he could not defeat this army in open battle. His forces numbered perhaps 30,000 at most, and even that figure may be optimistic. He lacked the siege equipment, the professional infantry, and the resources to meet the Ottomans on equal terms. Conventional warfare meant certain destruction, so Vlad chose unconventional methods. He implemented a scorched earth strategy of remarkable thoroughness. As the Ottoman army advanced, they found a devastated landscape. Crops had been burned before they could be harvested. Wells had been poisoned or filled with debris. Villages stood empty, their populations evacuated north into the mountains with whatever livestock and supplies they could carry. The roads the Ottomans needed for their supply wagons had been sabotaged, bridges destroyed, fords made impassable. The invaders found themselves marching through a wasteland of their enemies' deliberate creation. Vlad's forces did not disappear entirely. They lurked at the edges of the Ottoman column, launching guerrilla attacks on supply convoys, ambushing foraging parties, striking at night, and vanishing before the Janissaries could respond. Ottoman soldiers died in ones and twos, picked off by enemies they rarely saw. Disease began spreading through the ranks, exacerbated by tainted water and inadequate provisions. The great army that had seemed invincible at the Danube crossing was being bled slowly as it stumbled deeper into hostile territory. Then came the night attack. On the 17th of June, 1462, Vlad launched his most audacious operation. With a force of approximately 7,000 to 10,000 cavalry, the core of his remaining army, he struck directly at the Ottoman camp near Târgoviște under cover of darkness. The objective was not merely to inflict casualties. It was to kill Mehmed himself and end the war in a single stroke. The attack achieved complete surprise. Wallachian horsemen swept through the Ottoman encampment, cutting down soldiers still half asleep, setting fire to tents, creating chaos throughout the sprawling camp. In the darkness and confusion, Ottoman units fought each other, unable to distinguish friend from enemy. The chronicles describe hours of mayhem, with Vlad's cavalry charging repeatedly into different sections of the camp before withdrawing and attacking elsewhere. But the primary objective failed. Vlad was hunting the Sultan's tent, and in the darkness he found the wrong one. Mehmed was either elsewhere in the camp or had been moved when the attack began. By dawn, when the Ottomans finally reorganised and the Wallachian cavalry withdrew, the Sultan was still alive. Casualty figures for the night attack are uncertain. Ottoman sources acknowledge significant losses, but understandably minimise them. Wallachian and later European sources claim thousands of Ottoman dead. What is clear is that the attack rattled the invaders. An enemy who could strike at the Sultan's own camp, who could appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly, who seemed willing to take any risk. Such an enemy was more dangerous than raw numbers suggested. Mehmed pressed forward regardless. Whatever his private concerns, He could not retreat without achieving something. His army continued its advance toward Târgoviște, expecting to find Vlad making a final stand at his capital. What they found instead would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the Ottoman vanguard approached Târgoviște, they encountered a sight that stopped the army in its tracks. Lining the road for approximately 1 kilometre, stretching toward the city walls, was a forest of stakes. And on those stakes were bodies, thousands upon thousands of them, impaled and left to rot. Ottoman chroniclers, who recorded the event, estimated the number of victims at approximately 20,000. The bodies were arranged in rows, some sources say in geometric patterns, a grotesque display of methodical cruelty. Many of the impaled were Ottoman prisoners captured during Vlad's winter campaign and the subsequent guerrilla operations. They had been kept alive specifically for this purpose, preserved so they could die slowly on the stakes as a message to the advancing army. The psychological impact was profound. According to the chronicler Tursun Beg, who accompanied the campaign, soldiers refused to advance further. Hardened veterans who had stormed the walls of Constantinople and butchered its defenders stood frozen before this spectacle. Even Mehmed, who had never shown squeamishness about violence, reportedly expressed something between disgust and grudging respect. What can one do against a man who is capable of such things? He allegedly asked. The Sultan faced a choice. He could continue the campaign against an enemy who clearly had no limits, whose territory was devastated, whose people were hidden in mountains, whose army refused pitched battle but struck without warning in the night. Or he could declare a political victory and withdraw, leaving behind a proxy to continue the fight. Mehmed chose the latter option. He installed Vlad's younger brother Radu, the charming one, the compliant one, the boy who had stayed in Ottoman territory and converted to Islam, as the rival claimant to the Wallachian throne. Radu cel Frumos, Radu the Handsome, would rule Wallachia as a loyal Ottoman vassal. The main Ottoman army turned south and marched back toward the Danube, their mission officially complete, their spirits considerably less triumphant than when they had arrived. Vlad had survived, against impossible odds, through tactics that appalled even his contemporaries. He had driven off the greatest military power on earth. But the war was far from over. Radu remained, backed by Ottoman gold and Ottoman soldiers. And the boyars who had suffered under Vlad's terror were already calculating whether the brother might offer a better future than the Impaler. The Ottoman army had withdrawn, but Mehmed had left behind a weapon far more dangerous than any military force. Radu cel Frumos, Vlad's younger brother, now claimed the Wallachian throne with the full backing of the Ottoman Empire. The war that followed would not be fought against foreign invaders. It would be fought against Vlad's own people. Radu possessed advantages that Vlad could not match. He had Ottoman soldiers at his command, not the massive invasion force that had retreated across the Danube, but enough troops to tip the balance in a civil conflict. He had Ottoman gold to distribute among potential supporters. He had spent his formative years at the Ottoman court, building relationships with powerful figures including, according to persistent rumours, an intimate connection with Sultan Mehmed himself. Whether their relationship was romantic, political or both, Radu had the Sultan's personal favour in a way that translated directly into military and financial support. Most importantly, Radu offered the Wallachian boyars something Vlad never could: a return to the old ways. He promised to restore the privileges that Vlad had stripped from the nobility. He promised consultation rather than autocracy, accommodation rather than terror. For boyars who had watched their peers impaled, who had seen ancient families destroyed, who lived in constant fear that one misstep would earn them a stake, Radu represented survival. The defections began almost immediately after the Ottoman withdrawal. Boyar families who had bent the knee to Vlad now calculated that his position was untenable. He had survived the Ottoman invasion, yes, but at what cost? His lands were devastated by his own scorched earth campaign. His treasury was empty. His army had been bled by months of guerrilla warfare, and now a rival claimant with Ottoman backing was offering amnesty to anyone who switched sides. The choice for many nobles was obvious. Throughout the second half of 1462, Vlad's support collapsed. Towns that had acknowledged his rule opened their gates to Radu. Military commanders who had fought beside him during the night attack now led their troops into his brother's camp. The elaborate system of personal loyalty that Vlad had constructed, the new men, the slugatori, the administrators who owed everything to him, proved insufficient against the combined pressure of Ottoman power and boyar self-interest. Vlad retreated to his fortress at Poenari, the castle that boyar slaves had built for him high in the Carpathian mountains. It was the strongest position he held, perched on a cliff overlooking the Argesh River, accessible only by a narrow staircase of over 1,000 steps carved into the rock face. Here at least he could hold out indefinitely against a besieging force. Radu's troops followed and surrounded the fortress. What happened next has been heavily mythologized in Romanian folklore, making it difficult to separate fact from legend. The most famous story concerns Vlad's wife, whose name has not been preserved in any reliable source. According to tradition, when it became clear that the fortress would fall, she climbed to the highest tower and threw herself into the river below rather than be captured by the Ottomans. The river beneath Poenari is still sometimes called the Lady's River in her memory. Whether this event actually occurred is uncertain. The story does not appear in contemporary sources and may have been invented or embellished in later centuries. What is documented is that Vlad escaped from Poenari, probably through a secret passage in the mountain behind the fortress, and fled north into Transylvania. His wife's fate, indeed her very identity, remains unknown. Vlad crossed into Hungarian-controlled territory, expecting to find allies. He had spent years in Transylvania during his earlier exile. He had fought alongside Hungarian forces. He had positioned himself as a defender of Christendom against Ottoman expansion, sending detailed reports of his campaigns to King Matthias Corvinus. Surely Hungary would support him now, when he needed help most. Instead, Matthias had him arrested. The circumstances of Vlad's imprisonment have been debated by historians for centuries. The official justification was a set of letters, allegedly written by Vlad, in which he offered to betray Hungary to the Ottomans in exchange for being restored to the Wallachian throne. The letters supposedly proved that Vlad was negotiating with Mehmed, promising to become a loyal Ottoman vassal, and to turn against his Hungarian allies if the Sultan would help him defeat Radu. If genuine, these letters would have made Vlad a traitor of the worst kind, a man willing to sell out his Christian allies to the Islamic enemy he had publicly sworn to fight. Matthias would have been fully justified in arresting him, and the Hungarian king made sure the letters were widely circulated to explain his actions. But were they genuine? Many historians, both medieval and modern, have expressed serious doubts. The letters were suspiciously convenient for Matthias, who had received substantial funds from Pope Pius II, specifically to launch a crusade against the Ottomans. Instead of using that money for its intended purpose, Matthias had largely kept it for other expenses. Vlad's winter offensive and subsequent defence against the Ottoman invasion had been conducted with minimal Hungarian support, despite Vlad's desperate appeals for assistance. If Matthias had to explain why he had failed to help a Christian prince fighting the Ottomans, and why he was now imprisoning that prince instead of supporting his restoration. Forged letters proving treachery would solve multiple problems at once. Vlad could be blamed for his own downfall. Hungarian inaction could be retrospectively justified, and Matthias could avoid the costly and dangerous prospect of a new war with Mehmed. The scholarly debate continues without definitive resolution. Some historians accept the letters as authentic, arguing that Vlad was desperate enough to consider any option. Others view them as obvious fabrications, noting inconsistencies in their content and the convenient timing of their discovery. The truth may never be known with certainty. What is certain is the outcome. Vlad Dracula, who had defied the Ottoman Empire, survived an assassination attempt on the Sultan himself, and created the most infamous display of impalement in history, found himself a prisoner of his supposed allies. He would remain in Hungarian captivity for the next 12 years. His throne lost, his reputation destroyed by the very letters that may have been invented to justify his imprisonment. The Impaler had been brought low not by Ottoman might, but by Christian betrayal. 12 years is a long time to be a prisoner. It is also a long time for political circumstances to change, for enemies to die, for opportunities to emerge. Vlad Dracula entered Hungarian captivity as a disgraced traitor, accused of conspiring with the Ottomans he had so publicly fought. He would emerge as a rehabilitated ally, married into the Hungarian royal family, ready to reclaim his throne. The transformation required patience, calculation, and a willingness to abandon principles he had once held dear. The early years of captivity were genuinely harsh. Vlad was held initially at Buda, the Hungarian capital, and later moved to the fortress of Visegrad on the Danube, a royal residence that also served as a high-security prison for valuable captives. He was not thrown into a dungeon. His status as a prince, even a disgraced one, afforded certain privileges, but he was closely watched, his movements restricted, his future entirely dependent on the whims of King Matthias Corvinus. Stories from this period suggest that captivity did not soften Vlad's temperament. According to accounts that circulated later, he continued to practice his signature method of punishment on the only victims available to him. He allegedly caught birds and mice, carefully impaled them on tiny wooden sticks, and arranged their bodies in patterns. Some accounts describe him buying birds at market specifically for this purpose. Whether these stories are true, exaggerated, or entirely invented is impossible to verify. They may reflect genuine behaviour, a man so accustomed to violence that he could not stop even when deprived of human victims. Or they may be embellishments added by hostile chroniclers eager to emphasise his pathological cruelty. The tales persisted regardless, contributing to the legend of a man who could not exist without inflicting pain. As the years passed, the conditions of Vlad's imprisonment gradually relaxed. Strict confinement gave way to house arrest, then to something approaching freedom within the Hungarian court. The reasons for this softening were primarily political. Matthias Corvinus was engaged in complex diplomatic manoeuvring throughout the 1460s and early 1470s, balancing relationships with the Ottomans, the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and various neighbouring powers. A Wallachian prince in reserve, someone who could potentially be installed on that troublesome throne when circumstances permitted, had value. Dead or broken, Vlad was worthless. Alive and cooperative, he was a card that could be played when the game required it. Vlad understood this calculation and adapted accordingly. If survival required cooperation, he would cooperate. If advancement required conversion, he would convert. Sometime during his captivity, Vlad abandoned the Orthodox Christianity of his birth and accepted Roman Catholicism. The conversion was almost certainly a political necessity rather than a spiritual transformation. The Hungarian court was Catholic, the king was Catholic, and any prince hoping to regain favour and eventually military support needed to align himself with the religious establishment that dominated Central European politics. Vlad made the required gestures, whatever his private beliefs may have been. The clearest sign of his rehabilitation came with his marriage. At some point during his captivity, probably in the early 1470s, Vlad married a woman connected to the Hungarian royal family. Her identity is not entirely certain. The most commonly cited candidate is Ilona Szilágyi, a cousin of King Matthias, but her significance is clear regardless of her exact name. Marriage into the Corvinus family network meant acceptance, reintegration, a future beyond the walls of Visegrad. The union produced at least 2 sons, ensuring that Vlad's line would continue even if he himself never regained power. Meanwhile, events in Wallachia were creating the opportunity Vlad needed. His brother Radu Telfrumos had ruled as an Ottoman vassal since 1462, maintaining the tributary relationship and keeping the boyars reasonably satisfied. But Radu's position was never entirely secure. He faced challenges from other claimants, periodic Ottoman demands that strained his resources, and the inherent instability of Wallachian politics that had destroyed so many princes before him. In 1473 or 1474, Radu was briefly overthrown, then restored, then faced renewed challenges. His health was also failing. In January of 1475, Radu Telfrumos died. The cause is not recorded with certainty, possibly illness, possibly something more sinister, but the result was another succession crisis in Wallachia. The throne passed to a member of the rival Danest branch, Basarab Laiota, who proved unable to maintain stable control. Within months, he was facing challenges from multiple directions, including renewed Ottoman pressure. For Matthias Corvinus, this chaos presented an opportunity. A strong, capable and loyal prince in Wallachia would serve Hungarian interests far better than the weak and unstable rulers who had followed Radu. And Matthias happened to have just such a prince available, one who had spent 12 years demonstrating his willingness to cooperate, who had converted to Catholicism, who had married into the royal family, and who had every reason to be grateful for a second chance at power. In 1476, Matthias authorised a campaign to restore Vlad Dracula to the Wallachian throne. Hungarian troops and Transylvanian forces would provide the military muscle. Stephen the Great of Moldavia, Vlad's cousin and one of the most capable rulers in the region, agreed to contribute soldiers as well. Vlad himself would lead the invasion, returning to the land he had fled 14 years earlier as a desperate fugitive. The campaign launched in late 1476. Vlad crossed into Wallachia with his Hungarian and Moldavian allies, swept aside the resistance offered by Basarab Laiota, and entered Targovishte in triumph. By November, he was once again voivode of Wallachia, seated on the throne he had fought so hard to win, lost so catastrophically, and now reclaimed against all odds. He was 45 years old, hardened by decades of war, captivity and betrayal. He had outlasted his brother, outmaneuvered his captors, and returned from what had seemed like permanent exile. The Impaler was back. His third reign would last approximately 2 months. The third reign of Vlad Dracula is the most obscure period of his life. We know when it began, November of 1476, and approximately when it ended, late December of that year, or early January of 1477. We know the broad military and political context, but the details that would bring this final chapter into focus are largely missing from the historical record. Few administrative documents survive from these weeks. No chronicles describe his actions in any depth. The man who had generated so much documentation through his spectacular violence left barely a trace during his final days in power. What we do know is that Vlad's position was precarious from the moment he reclaimed the throne. The Hungarian and Moldavian forces that had installed him did not remain in Wallachia indefinitely. Stephen the Great of Moldavia withdrew his troops relatively quickly, called away by concerns in his own territory. The Hungarian contingent likewise departed, leaving Vlad to hold his restored principality with whatever local forces he could muster. After 12 years of absence, his network of loyal supporters had largely disintegrated. The new men he had elevated during his second reign were dead, exiled, or had made their peace with subsequent rulers. The boyars who remained had learned to survive by switching allegiances, and their commitment to Vlad was questionable at best. Meanwhile, the Ottomans had no intention of accepting his return. Basarab Laiota, the Danish prince whom Vlad had displaced, fled south across the Danube and immediately began soliciting Ottoman support for a counterattack. The Turks had every reason to help him. Vlad Dracula, on the Wallachian throne, was a proven enemy, a man who had humiliated Sultan Mehmed's, impaled Ottoman envoys, and slaughtered thousands of Turkish subjects. Basarab Laiota, whatever his limitations, would be a compliant vassal. The choice was obvious. By late December, Ottoman-backed forces were moving against Vlad. The exact sequence of events is unclear, but the military pressure was mounting. Vlad found himself defending a throne he had barely had time to occupy, with inadequate troops, unreliable allies, and enemies closing in from multiple directions. He died sometime around the end of December 1476, or the very beginning of January 1477. The location was somewhere near Bucharest, probably during a military engagement with either Ottoman forces or troops loyal to Basarab Laiota. Beyond these bare facts, almost everything about his death is disputed. One account holds that Vlad fell in battle against the Ottomans, fighting to the end as he had always fought, overwhelmed by superior numbers but refusing to surrender. This version fits the heroic narrative that would later develop in Romanian folklore. The warrior prince dying sword in hand against the enemies of his people. A second account suggests he was killed by his own men. According to this version, Wallachian soldiers, possibly boyars, who had never forgiven him for his earlier atrocities, possibly troops who simply saw no future in continued resistance, turned on Vlad during the confusion of battle and cut him down. Some versions specify that he was wearing Ottoman-style clothing as a disguise and was mistaken for an enemy soldier, though this explanation has the flavour of an excuse invented after the fact. A third possibility is that he was assassinated by agents of Basarab Laiota or the Ottomans, targeted for elimination rather than killed in the chaos of combat. The circumstances would have provided ample opportunity for such an attack to be disguised as a battlefield death. What happened to Vlad's body is somewhat clearer, at least initially. The Ottomans claimed to have received his severed head, which was reportedly sent to Constantinople, and displayed there as a proof that the infamous Impaler was finally dead. Sultan Mehmed, who had turned back from Târgoviște 14 years earlier rather than face the forest of the impaled, could now look upon the face of his enemy preserved in honey or brine. The display served both as satisfaction for the Sultan and as a message to any other vassal princes who might consider defiance. The rest of Vlad's body, according to tradition, was buried at Snagov Monastery, located on an island in Snagov Lake, north of Bucharest. The monastery had connections to Vlad's family and had reportedly received his patronage during his reign. It would have been a logical resting place for a Wallachian prince, even one as controversial as the Impaler. For centuries, this account was accepted without serious challenge. Then, in 1931, Romanian archaeologists led by Dinu Rossetti conducted excavations at Snagov, hoping to locate and examine Vlad's remains. What they found, or rather, what they failed to find, raised more questions than it answered. The grave traditionally identified as Vlad's, located before the altar of the monastery church, was empty. There was no body, no coffin, no sign that anyone had ever been buried there. The absence was startling. Had the grave been robbed? Had Vlad been buried elsewhere? Had the tradition identifying this spot been wrong all along? Further excavation revealed a second grave near the entrance of the church, beneath a stone slab that had no inscription. This grave contained a body, headless, dressed in fragments of expensive clothing that appeared consistent with 15th century aristocratic fashion. Some items found with the body, including a ring and fabric remnants, suggested a person of high status. The decapitation was consistent with the account of Vlad's head being sent to Constantinople. But was this actually Vlad? The identification has been disputed ever since. The body was in poor condition, making detailed analysis difficult. The clothing fragments could have belonged to any wealthy individual of the period, and the location near the church entrance was unusual for a prince, whose remains would typically be placed in a position of greater honour. Some scholars have accepted the identification. Others consider it unproven or unlikely. The mystery deepened when the remains excavated in 1931 subsequently disappeared. The body that might or might not have been Vlad Dracula was reportedly moved, lost, or perhaps deliberately hidden during the turbulent decades that followed. Modern researchers hoping to apply DNA analysis or other scientific techniques have been unable to locate the remains. So Vlad Dracula's final resting place remains unknown. The head that was displayed in Constantinople has long since vanished. The body that may have been buried at Snagov cannot be found. The Impaler, who made such elaborate displays of other people's deaths, left no certain trace of his own. Vlad Dracula was among the first people in history to be destroyed by the printing press. The technology that Johannes Gutenberg had perfected in the 1450s spread rapidly across Europe, and printers quickly discovered that sensational content sold far better than scholarly texts. Stories of atrocity, horror, and cruelty found eager audiences. And no contemporary figure provided better material than the Impaler of Wallachia. The German pamphlets about Vlad began appearing during his own lifetime, possibly as early as the 1460s, with production accelerating after his death. They were short, cheap publications, a few pages of text accompanied by dramatic woodcut illustrations, designed to be sold at markets and fairs to readers hungry for lurid entertainment. They were, in essence, the tabloid journalism of their era, and Vlad was their ideal subject. The Transylvanian Saxons were the primary source of information for these pamphlets. The merchants and survivors of Brasov and Sibiu had witnessed Vlad's raids firsthand. They had seen their neighbours impaled, their suburbs burned, their commerce disrupted by a prince they considered a monster. When German printers came looking for details about the infamous Wallachian ruler, Saxon communities were eager to provide them. The accounts they gave were shaped by genuine trauma, but also by genuine hatred, and the resulting pamphlets reflected both. The most influential of these publications was a pamphlet known as Die Geschichte Dracula Wade, the story of Voivode Dracula, first printed in 1488 by a publisher in Nuremberg. It was not the earliest pamphlet about Vlad, but it became the most widely distributed, going through at least 13 editions before the end of the 15th century. For a single publication to achieve that many printings in such a short time indicates extraordinary popular demand. Readers across the German-speaking world could not get enough of the Impaler's horrors. The pamphlet catalogued Vlad's atrocities in vivid detail. Mass impalement featured prominently, with descriptions of forests of stakes and victims arranged in geometric patterns. The Easter massacre of the Boyars was recounted. The raids on Saxon territory were described from the victim's perspective. The story of Vlad dining among the impaled appeared in multiple versions, emphasizing his apparent enjoyment of suffering. Other episodes in the pamphlets have become infamous in their own right. One describes Vlad inviting beggars and the sick to a great feast, ostensibly as an act of charity. When they had eaten their fill, he asked whether they wished to be free of all worldly cares. They answered yes. He then had the building sealed and set on fire, burning everyone inside alive. The story illustrated Vlad's twisted logic. He had freed them from their suffering, just as he had promised, while shocking readers with its casual cruelty. The woodcut illustrations that accompanied these pamphlets established the visual image of Vlad that would persist for centuries. The most famous depicts a crowned figure seated at a table laden with food, calmly dining while surrounded by impaled victims. The bodies are shown in various stages of death, some still writhing on their stakes, while Vlad eats with apparent indifference. This image, the tyrant feasting amid suffering, became the defining representation of the Impaler, reproduced and adapted countless times over the following 500 years. But the German pamphlets were not the only tradition that preserved Vlad's memory. In Russia, a very different account emerged, one that presented the same events in a remarkably different light. The Russian text, known as the Tale of Dracula, was probably composed in the late 15th century, possibly by a diplomat named Fyodor Kurizin, who had travelled in the region. Unlike the German pamphlets, which portrayed Vlad as a monster without redeeming qualities, the Russian tale presented him as cruel but just, a harsh ruler whose severity served legitimate purposes. The Russian version included many of the same stories found in the German sources, but framed them differently. The impalement of criminals was presented as effective law enforcement rather than sadistic excess. Vlad's harsh punishments were shown creating a society where theft was unknown, where merchants could leave gold unattended without fear of loss. The famous story of the golden cup in the town square appeared in the Russian account as evidence of Vlad's success in establishing order, not as an illustration of rule through terror. One story found in the Russian tradition, but absent from the German pamphlets, involves two monks who visited Vlad's court. The prince showed them his impaled victims and asked what they thought of the display. The first monk, either brave or foolish, condemned the cruelty as sinful. Vlad had him impaled. The second monk praised the prince's justice, declaring that the victims must have deserved their fate. Vlad rewarded him and sent him away unharmed. The story could be read as illustrating Vlad's tyranny, executing a man for honest criticism, or as a dark joke about the nature of power and the wisdom of flattery. The contrasting German and Russian traditions posed challenges for historians attempting to reconstruct the real Vlad. Both contain genuine historical information. Both also contain propaganda, exaggeration, and bias. The German pamphlets were produced by people who hated Vlad and wanted him remembered as a monster. The Russian tale was composed by someone who saw value in strong, harsh rulership and wanted to explore that theme through Vlad's example. Neither source is neutral. Modern scholars approach these texts with appropriate caution. The atrocities described in the pamphlets are not dismissed as fiction. Too many independent sources confirm that Vlad practiced mass impalement and ruled through terror, but specific details are treated as potentially embellished. Numbers of victims are regarded as unreliable. Particular episodes, especially those with suspiciously neat narrative structures, may have been invented or elaborated for dramatic effect. The goal is to extract the historical kernel from the sensationalist husk, though the two are not always easy to separate. What remains undeniable is the pamphlet's impact on Vlad's posthumous reputation. Within decades of his death, he had become one of the most infamous figures in European popular culture, his name synonymous with cruelty, his image fixed as the tyrant dining among the dying. The Transylvanian Saxons he had terrorised achieved a form of revenge that no military campaign could have accomplished. They made him a monster forever. After the pamphlet era faded, Vlad Dracula largely disappeared from European consciousness. The printing presses moved on to new sensations. The German-speaking world found other monsters to horrify readers. For roughly 3 centuries, the Impaler was remembered primarily in the lands where he had actually lived, Romania and the surrounding regions, preserved in folklore, local legends, and the occasional scholarly reference rather than popular culture. Romanian peasants told stories about Vlad that differed markedly from the German pamphlet tradition. In these tales, he appeared as a harsh but fair ruler, a prince who had punished the wicked and protected the common people from boyar exploitation. The impalement of criminals became evidence of effective justice rather than sadistic cruelty. Vlad was remembered as someone who had made the road safe, who had ensured that thieves and liars met appropriate ends. The folklore contained darkness, certainly, but it was the darkness of a stern father rather than a psychopathic monster. Separately from any memory of the historical Vlad, Eastern Europe had developed rich traditions of vampire folklore. The Romanian strigoi, restless dead, who returned from the grave to trouble the living, had roots stretching back centuries before Vlad's birth. Similar beliefs existed throughout the Balkans, in Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and beyond. These were not elegant aristocrats in evening dress. They were bloated corpses, often peasants who had died badly or been improperly buried, who emerged at night to drink blood or spread disease. Communities had elaborate rituals for identifying vampires and preventing their return, including staking corpses through the heart, decapitation, and cremation. There is no evidence that Vlad Dracula was associated with vampirism during his lifetime or in the centuries immediately following his death. He was remembered as a cruel ruler and a prolific killer, but not as an undead creature who drank blood. The connection between the historical Impaler and the vampire myth would be forged much later, by a man who knew almost nothing about the real Vlad. Bram Stoker was an Irish theatre manager who spent years developing what would become the most famous horror novel in the English language. His research for the book, that became Dracula, published in 1897, was extensive but selective. He read accounts of Transylvania and Wallachia, studied maps of the region, and collected information about Eastern European folklore and superstition. Among his sources was a book by William Wilkinson titled An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, published in 1820, which contained brief references to a Wallachian voivode called Dracula. Wilkinson's book mentioned that Dracula meant devil in the Wallachian language, a slight simplification of the more complex etymology involving dragons, and noted that the name had been applied to a prince known for his cruelty. Stoker copied this information into his research notes. He was struck by the name itself, which seemed to carry inherent menace. The sound of it, those hard consonants, that sinister final syllable, was perfect for a villain. Stoker's original conception of his vampire antagonist had not involved the name Dracula at all. Early notes and drafts reveal that he initially planned to call his villain Count Wampir, a straightforward if uninspired choice. The substitution of Dracula came relatively late in the creative process, adopted primarily because it sounded better. Stoker took the name, the Transylvanian setting, and a few scattered references to the historical figure's conflicts with the Turks. Almost everything else about Count Dracula, the aristocratic manor, the castle in a mountain pass, the supernatural powers, the vulnerability to garlic and crucifixes, came from vampire folklore, Gothic literary traditions, and Stoker's own imagination. The novel was a modest success upon publication, but not an immediate sensation. Its transformation into a cultural phenomenon came through adaptation, particularly theatrical productions and eventually film. The 1931 Universal Pictures production, starring Bela Lugosi, fixed the image of Dracula in the popular imagination. The formal evening wear, the slicked back hair, the Hungarian accent, the hypnotic stare. Lugosi's portrayal became definitive, copied and parodied countless times over the following decades. As Dracula the vampire became one of the most recognisable figures in global popular culture, audiences naturally grew curious about the historical figure behind the name. This curiosity created a conflation that would have baffled both Bram Stoker and the real Vlad. The fictional vampire and the historical prince became merged in popular understanding, despite having almost nothing in common beyond a name and a general geographic association. Vlad had been many things: brutal, cunning, effective, terrifying, but he had not been undead, had not drunk blood, except possibly in metaphorical accounts of dining among the impaled, and had not possessed any supernatural powers. Romania itself eventually embraced the connection, particularly after the fall of communism in 1989 opened the country to Western tourism. The vampire association that might once have seemed an insult to national heritage was repackaged as an economic opportunity. Bran Castle, a medieval fortress in Transylvania with minimal historical connection to Vlad. He may have passed through the region, but almost certainly never resided there, was marketed internationally as Dracula's Castle. Tour operators developed packages promising visitors an encounter with the legend. Gift shops sold vampire-themed merchandise alongside traditional Romanian crafts. The actual sites associated with the historical Vlad, Târgoviște, Poenari, Snagov Monastery, attracted visitors as well, though often filtered through the vampire mythology rather than approached as straightforward historical locations. The conflation was commercially useful, even if historically nonsensical. Tourists who came looking for Dracula, the vampire, could be introduced to Vlad the Impaler, and vice versa. The result is a figure who exists simultaneously in multiple registers. There is the historical Vlad, recoverable through careful scholarship and critical reading of biased sources. There is the folkloric Vlad of Romanian tradition, the harsh but just ruler. There is Stoker's Count Dracula, the aristocratic vampire with his castle and his brides. And there is the merged figure of popular culture, part history and part fiction, in which a 15th century Wallachian prince somehow becomes an immortal creature of the night. These versions coexist, overlap, and contaminate each other. Separating them requires deliberate effort that most casual consumers of the Dracula legend never make. The vampire Dracula is a Western invention. In Romania itself, Vlad has been remembered very differently. Not as a monster, but as a hero, not as an object of horror, but as a source of national pride. This transformation began in the 19th century and accelerated through the 20th, reshaping the Impaler from a byword for cruelty into a symbol of patriotic resistance. The context was Romanian nationalism. For centuries, the Romanian-speaking territories of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania had been dominated by foreign powers. The Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Hungarian Kingdom, and later the Russian Empire. The movement for Romanian unity and independence that gathered strength in the 1800s required historical heroes who could embody national resistance. Vlad Dracula, who had defied the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power, fit the need perfectly. 19th century Romanian intellectuals began rehabilitating Vlad's reputation with systematic determination. They emphasized his military achievements: the night attack, the scorched earth campaign, the forest of the impaled that had turned back Mehmed the Conqueror. They reframed his brutality as harsh necessity, the methods required to survive in a world of powerful enemies and treacherous nobles. The atrocities documented in German pamphlets were dismissed as foreign propaganda, exaggerations by Saxon merchants who had opposed Romanian interests and wanted revenge for their commercial losses. The poet Mihai Eminescu, widely considered the national poet of Romania, contributed to this rehabilitation in the late 19th century. His works invoked Vlad as part of a glorious past, when Romanian rulers had stood firm against foreign domination. Eminescu and writers like him created a literary tradition in which Vlad represented strength, independence, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect the nation. The impalement of enemies became a regrettable but understandable response to existential threats rather than evidence of pathological cruelty. This nationalist interpretation intensified dramatically under communist rule, particularly during the regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, who governed Romania from 1965 until his overthrow and execution in 1989. Ceausescu cultivated a nationalist version of communism that emphasized Romanian independence from Soviet domination. He positioned himself as the latest in a line of strong Romanian leaders who had resisted foreign interference, and he found in Vlad Dracula a historical predecessor whose image could be shaped to serve contemporary purposes. Under Ceausescu, the rehabilitation of Vlad became official policy. Historians were encouraged to present him as a progressive ruler who had modernized Wallachia, centralized the state, and defended national sovereignty. The destruction of the boyars was recast as a blow against feudal exploitation, a proto-revolutionary act that had benefited common Romanians by breaking aristocratic power. The mass impalement of criminals was presented as effective law enforcement that had created unprecedented security. Vlad became, in this telling, a harsh but necessary leader whose methods had been justified by results. The 1979 film Vlad Tepes, directed by Doru Nastase, exemplified this approach. Produced with government approval and resources, the film presented a sympathetic portrayal of Vlad as a patriotic ruler forced into difficult choices by circumstances beyond his control. The Ottoman threat was emphasized. The treachery of the boyars was highlighted. The impalement, while not hidden, was contextualized as the response of a besieged leader to genuine enemies. The film was not subtle propaganda. It was explicit rehabilitation, designed to make Romanian audiences see Vlad as a national hero rather than a historical villain. Ceausescu's personal identification with Vlad was unmistakable to contemporaries. Both were Romanian rulers who defied foreign powers. Both centralized authority and crushed domestic opposition. Both cultivated images as defenders of national independence. The parallel was intentional and politically useful, allowing Ceausescu to wrap himself in historical legitimacy while justifying his own authoritarian methods as necessary for national survival. The fall of communism in 1989 complicated Vlad's status without resolving it. Ceausescu's execution discredited many aspects of his regime, including the cult of personality he had built around himself. The explicit identification of Vlad with Ceausescu-style authoritarianism became awkward. At the same time, the opening of Romania to Western tourism brought the vampire mythology flooding in, creating a new set of complications. Romanians found their historical figure being marketed to foreigners as a fictional monster, which many found offensive regardless of their views on the actual Vlad. Contemporary Romanian attitudes toward Vlad are genuinely ambivalent. Surveys and cultural studies suggest a population divided between pride in his military resistance and discomfort with his methods. Many Romanians resent the vampire association, viewing it as a foreign distortion that overshadows legitimate history. Many also resist the nationalist hero narrative, recognizing that impaling tens of thousands of people, including many of Vlad's own subjects, cannot be explained away as mere propaganda or justified necessity. The scholarly debate mirrors this popular ambivalence. Historians who specialize in the period disagree about how to assess Vlad's legacy. Some emphasize his genuine military achievements and argue that his methods, while extreme, were not unusual for the era and achieved real results in stabilizing Wallachia and resisting Ottoman expansion. Others counter that the scale of his atrocities exceeded any strategic necessity, that impaling criminals for petty theft served terror rather than justice, and that the destruction of the boyars created as many problems as it solved. Comparisons with other controversial national figures are instructive. Many countries have historical leaders who are reviled internationally but celebrated domestically. Genghis Khan is a national hero in Mongolia, despite his army's destruction of entire civilizations. Oliver Cromwell is admired by some in England, despite his brutal conquest of Ireland. Andrew Jackson appears on American currency, despite his responsibility for Native American ethnic cleansing. These figures share a common pattern. Actions that benefited one population while devastating others, remembered differently depending on which side of history one's ancestors occupied. Vlad fits this pattern precisely. For Romanians, whose ancestors survived Ottoman domination partly because of Vlad's resistance, he can be seen as a defender. For the descendants of those he impaled, Ottoman, Saxon, Boyar, or common Wallachian, he can only be seen as a murderer. Neither perspective is wrong. Both are incomplete. The historical Vlad was simultaneously a military leader of genuine capability and a perpetrator of atrocities on a massive scale. The challenge is holding both truths in mind at once, which neither nationalist hagiography nor foreign sensationalism has managed to do. How many people did Vlad Dracula kill? The question seems simple. The answer is anything but. The numbers cited in contemporary sources range from implausible to absurd. German pamphlets claim 100,000 victims or more. Ottoman chroniclers offered similarly inflated figures. Vlad's own letter to King Matthias Corvinus boasted of killing nearly 24,000 people in a single winter campaign, a number that may have been exaggerated for political effect. Modern historians attempting to establish reliable estimates face fundamental methodological problems that may never be fully resolved. The first problem is source bias. Almost every surviving account of Vlad's atrocities comes from people who hated him. The German pamphlets were produced by or for Transylvanian Saxons, whose communities he had attacked. Ottoman chronicles were written by subjects of the empire he had defied and humiliated. Even the Russian tales, while more ambivalent in tone, were not produced by neutral observers. Contemporary Wallachian sources that might have offered a different perspective have largely not survived. We are left trying to extract truth from propaganda, separating genuine atrocities from inventions and exaggerations designed to blacken an enemy's name. The second problem is the nature of medieval record-keeping. 15th century Wallachia did not maintain the kind of bureaucratic documentation that would allow precise victim counts. There were no systematic death registries, no census records that could be compared before and after Vlad's reign, no administrative apparatus designed to track executions. The numbers we have are estimates, often made by observers who were not present at the events they described and who had strong incentives to inflate their figures. Given these limitations, what can we reasonably conclude? Most modern scholars who have examined the evidence carefully suggest that the total number of Vlad's victims probably fell somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people over the 6 years of his main reign. This range acknowledges significant uncertainty, while recognizing that the atrocities were real and substantial even if the highest contemporary claims were exaggerated. Some historians argue for lower figures. A few accept numbers closer to the upper estimates in the sources. Precision is impossible. The victims themselves fell into several distinct categories. The first and most politically significant were Wallachian boyars and their families, the nobles whom Vlad systematically destroyed to consolidate his power. The Easter massacre and the construction of Poenari Castle eliminated dozens of aristocratic families, though the exact numbers are unknown. This category also includes rival claimants to the throne and their supporters, men like Dan III, who were hunted down and killed with deliberate ceremony. The second category comprised Transylvanian Saxon civilians and merchants, victims of Vlad's raids into the border regions around Brasov and Sibiu. These attacks targeted villages, suburbs and commercial caravans, killing ordinary people whose only offence was living in communities that had supported Vlad's enemies. The Saxon sources that document these raids were produced by the affected communities, and almost certainly provide more accurate detail for this category than for others. The third category consisted of Ottoman soldiers and prisoners of war. Vlad's winter campaign of 1461 to 1462 killed thousands along the Danube frontier. The forest of the impaled that greeted Mehmed's army outside Târgoviște contained approximately 20,000 bodies, according to Ottoman chroniclers. Primarily prisoners accumulated over months of guerrilla warfare, and kept alive specifically to be displayed as a psychological weapon. The fourth, and perhaps largest category, included common Wallachians accused of crimes. Vlad's harsh legal code prescribed impalement for offences including theft, adultery, lying, and various forms of misconduct. The enforcement of these laws over 6 years would have produced substantial numbers of victims from among Vlad's own subjects. These deaths attracted less attention from foreign chroniclers, but may have constituted a significant portion of the total. The geographic distribution of these atrocities was concentrated in several areas. Wallachia itself, particularly the region around the capital of Târgoviște, saw continuous executions throughout Vlad's reign. The Transylvanian border regions near Brasov and Sibiu suffered during the raiding campaigns. Ottoman-controlled territories south of the Danube, in what is now Bulgaria, were devastated during the winter offensive. The forest of the impaled was located along the main approach to Târgoviște. Contemporary observers across Europe were aware of Vlad's methods even before the pamphlet campaign made him famous. Diplomatic correspondence shows that the Ottoman court, the Hungarian court, the papal curia in Rome, and the extensive Venetian diplomatic network all had information about the Impaler and his practices. He was not an obscure regional figure whose atrocities went unnoticed. He was discussed, analysed, and condemned, or occasionally praised by the major powers of his era. The administrative mechanisms of mass killing under Vlad appear to have been relatively straightforward. Orders came directly from the prince. Implementation was carried out by loyal military officers and the new class of servants Vlad had elevated to replace the destroyed boyars. Executions were public by design, conducted in visible locations where the maximum number of people would witness them and spread word of what they had seen. The terror was not incidental. It was the point. Impalement itself was not unique to Vlad. The Ottomans used it for certain categories of criminals and rebels. The Hungarians employed it occasionally. Other medieval rulers had impaled enemies and criminals throughout European and Middle Eastern history. What distinguished Vlad was the systematic, sustained, large-scale employment of the method as a primary tool of governance. He did not impale occasionally as a special punishment for exceptional crimes. He impaled routinely, continuously, and in numbers that his contemporaries found shocking, even by the brutal standards of the age. The lasting impact on Wallachia is difficult to assess with precision, but was certainly significant. The elimination of the boyar class disrupted traditional social structures and created instability that outlasted Vlad's reign. The loss of population, whether through execution, flight, or the devastation of the Scorched Earth campaign against the Ottomans, weakened the principality economically and militarily. Vlad's successors inherited a land that had been traumatized by years of systematic terror, its institutions shattered, its people conditioned to expect arbitrary violence from their rulers. Whether this trauma was a necessary price for Vlad's achievements, the resistance to Ottoman expansion, the temporary establishment of order, is a question that admits no objective answer. It depends on values, on how one weighs military success against human suffering, on whether one believes that some political goals justify methods that would otherwise be condemned as atrocities. These are not questions historians can resolve. They can only document what happened and leave the moral judgments to others. Vlad Dracula was hated before he was famous. The hatred came first from those who experienced his methods directly. The Transylvanian Saxon merchants who survived his raids, the Ottoman soldiers who witnessed the forest of the impaled, the Wallachian boyars whose families were destroyed at Easter feasts and forced marches. These groups had personal reasons to despise him, and they expressed that hatred in the ways available to them, through diplomatic complaints, through chronicles, through the stories they told their children and their neighbours. What transformed local hatred into continental infamy was technology. The printing press, barely a generation old when Vlad began his reign, allowed his enemies to broadcast their grievances across Europe in ways that would have been impossible for earlier tyrants. The German pamphlets that circulated in the 1480s and 1490s reached audiences who had never heard of Wallachia and would never meet a Transylvanian Saxon. They made Vlad famous precisely because they made him horrifying. The printing press democratized information, and among the first information it democratized was sensationalized violence. Consider the counterfactual. If Vlad had lived a century earlier, before Gutenberg, his atrocities would have been known to contemporaries through manuscript chronicles and oral tradition. He would have been remembered in the regions he affected, Wallachia, Transylvania, the Ottoman frontier, but probably forgotten elsewhere within a generation or two. The pamphlets preserved his infamy, amplified it, and transmitted it across time and space. They made him immortal in the only way that matters. They ensured he would not be forgotten. The reputation they created has cycled through remarkable transformations over 5 centuries. In Western Europe, from the 15th through the 19th centuries, Vlad was remembered primarily as a monster, the tyrant who dined among the impaled, a cautionary tale about the depths of human cruelty. In Romania during the 19th and 20th centuries, he was rehabilitated as a nationalist hero, a defender of Romanian independence against foreign domination, his methods excused or minimised in service of patriotic narrative. In global popular culture, from the 20th century to the present, he has been conflated with the fictional vampire, his historical reality subsumed into a mythology that has little to do with the actual events of his life. Each version contains elements of truth. Each distorts through selection and emphasis. The monster of the German pamphlets was real. He did impale thousands. He did employ terror systematically. But the pamphlets were produced by enemies with motives to exaggerate. The nationalist hero of Romanian tradition was also real. He did resist the Ottomans. He did achieve military successes against impossible odds. But the nationalist narrative requires ignoring or excusing atrocities that cannot honestly be justified. The vampire icon is pure fiction, grafted onto a historical name. Yet it has become the version most people encounter first, shaping their perception of everything that follows. Why does Vlad remain compelling when countless other cruel rulers have been forgotten? The 15th century alone produced numerous tyrants who killed in large numbers, oppressed their populations, and died violently. Most are known only to specialists. Vlad is known to everyone. The difference lies partly in the pamphlets and their preservation of his story, but it lies also in the specific nature of his cruelty. Impalement is not merely lethal, it is theatrical. It transforms execution into spectacle, death into art. The rounded stake that prolongs suffering, the careful arrangement of bodies in geometric patterns, the deliberate choice to dine among the dying, these details suggest a mind that found aesthetic satisfaction in causing pain. This is what sets Vlad apart from rulers who killed through conventional warfare or ordinary judicial execution. He did not merely eliminate enemies. He made their elimination into a performance, and he appeared to enjoy it. Human psychology responds to this kind of cruelty differently than it responds to mass death through impersonal means. Millions can die in famines or plagues, or even genocides conducted through bureaucratic machinery, and the mind struggles to grasp the scale. But a single image of a man eating dinner while surrounded by the impaled registers immediately and viscerally. It is comprehensible in a way that statistics are not. It provokes horror, fascination, and a desire to understand how such a person could exist. The tension between contextualization and moral judgment runs through all historical assessment of figures like Vlad. Contextualization observes that the 15th century was brutal, that impalement was used by other powers, that Vlad faced genuine existential threats that may have required harsh responses. It asks us to judge historical figures by the standards of their time rather than our own, to understand before we condemn. Moral judgment counters that some actions are wrong regardless of context, that impaling tens of thousands of people, including one's own subjects, for petty crimes, exceeds any reasonable definition of military or political necessity, and that understanding should not become excuse. Both approaches have merit, neither is complete. The challenge is holding them in productive tension, acknowledging the genuine pressures Vlad faced while refusing to let those pressures justify everything he did. He was a product of brutal times, certainly. He was also a man who made choices, and many of those choices caused suffering that served no purpose beyond terror itself. The questions Vlad raises remain relevant because the dynamics he embodied have not disappeared. Political violence, state terror, and the justification of cruelty in the name of security continue to characterize human governance. leaders still argue that extreme measures are necessary to combat existential threats. States still employ methods designed to frighten populations into compliance. The debate over whether such methods are ever justified, and if so, under what circumstances and within what limits, continues in contexts far removed from 15th century Wallachia. Vlad offers no easy answers to these questions. He demonstrates that terror can be effective in the short term, that a ruler willing to go further than his enemies expect can achieve results that more restrained leaders cannot. He also demonstrates the costs, the trauma, the instability, the legacy of fear that outlasts any individual reign. Whether the results justified the costs in his case depends on values that history cannot adjudicate. What history can establish is simpler and more certain. Vlad Dracula was a man of genuine historical importance, who achieved remarkable military and political successes against formidable odds. He was also a man who caused immense suffering through methods specifically designed to maximize pain and terror. These facts coexist. They cannot be separated. Any account that emphasizes one while minimizing the other is incomplete. The real Dracula never drank blood. What he did was worse, not because drinking blood would be more harmful, but because what he actually did was real. Real people suffered on those stakes. Real families were destroyed. Real terror gripped real populations. 5 centuries later, we remember because the pamphlets preserved the horror, and because something in human nature remains fascinated by the depths to which human nature can sink. The Impaler earned his name. History has not forgotten.